Hi, I'm Ted Haptegaber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
Welcome, everybody. Some people I know, even with my glasses off. Just as a disclaimer, I've known Scott for a long time, and so he's a friend. So if the questions seem like they're a little bit of a softball, I apologize in advance. And we've worked together.
Why do you think I asked you?
I don't doubt that there was method to your madness. So I would like to start at the beginning of the book. And I'm going to just read very briefly the opening lines because that always interests me in a book. There's something weird with the dude next door to me. Quotes. Comma quotes. I tell Rick. Across the conference room table, his small, weary eyes rise reluctantly from the file he's reviewing. His brain seems to chase after my words for a second. Then he hits me with a sneaky little grin. And I say, oh, I get it. Look who's talking, right? But he's weird, maybe not me weird, but he's strange. You mean he doesn't have a nail through his nose? And that's the introduction to the book, and in the introduction to the character of Pinky. And for me, I really enjoyed her character, and she was in the prior book. So I thought I'd start by asking, why Pinky?
Well, I can give you a lot of rationalizations, most of which were not foremost in my mind when I decided to do this. The truth was that every novel is going well when there's a character who basically runs away with the book. And by that I mean a character who's got a planned role and who refuses to accept those limitations and demands more pages, more of the reader's attention. And Pinky was that character in The Last Trial, which is the prior novel, where she was working as a not particularly gifted paralegal in her grandfather's law office. And, I got such strong reader reaction to Pinky. People, I thought the book was boring, but man, I love Pinky, that kind of thing. that kind of thing. So, and I started to say to myself, do you really think you could write a book from her point of view? And I can look back and say it was sort of an act of challenging myself. I never wanted to write a sequel to Presumed Innocent immediately because I felt that was a trap that many writers fall into, which is, you write the same character, some version of the same story, and, for me and many other writers, you've worked a long time before you get struck by lightning. And, it just didn't make sense to me to sort of limit myself that way. And I've always tried to do something different in each book. So the challenge of writing from the point of view of somebody who is frankly, 40 years younger than I am, that was the big chasm to cross. And the fact that she's, bi and female, although that to me has always seemed less daunting since I know lots of women.
But how do you do it? How did you write her?
But And this gets into everybody who writes, there are plenty of people in this room who write, has this experience of having the characters just basically speak to you. They get into a conversation and you're just an observer. And that was what happened in writing this book. The lines that you just read are pretty much as I wrote them in the first draft. I'm sure I fiddled with them a little bit and tried to make them a little sleeker, and I at first was reluctant to believe I could get away with this, a 73-year-old man writing from the point of view of somebody who's 40 years younger and living a lifestyle that I don't live and frankly never have. So I sent 2 versions of the first chapter to my editor, Ben Sevier, and I wrote one in the third person, which is how I'd always assumed I was going to write the book, and the other in the first person, in the voice you just read. And I was perfectly happy to have Ben say to me, nah, this doesn't work. It's, you can hear the machinery rattling in the background. But he said, I really agree with you. I think this is more immediate, more lively, and if you can't carry it off for 400 pages, then we'll talk about rewriting it. But it can't be that hard, he said, to rewrite it in the third person.
Says the editor.
Right, says the editor. But so that's how it happened.
So how did you approach the generational issues and the voice even?
Some of it was just automatic. Some of it was, literally listening on public transportation. Some of it was internet research. And ultimately, I had a lot of younger readers, and they complained that I was using too much of the jargon that, frankly, I'd heard on TV or the internet, and that no, nobody I know says that, whatever the internet says. So I accepted that kind of guidance.
So when you take a character who's got a nail through her nose,
Yeah,
and who is unabashedly sexual,
yeah,
with both men and women, and who, in her own words, has what many people would call impulse control,
yeah.
but also enjoys her life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not that she doesn't have any suffering, and she enjoys her sexual experiences. She's very forthright about that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, she's quite guarded, right?
Yeah, well, this was something that Pinky explains, and it really rang true to me, that first of all, she's a terrific athlete and has always had great faith in her body. She was once an Olympic hopeful on the snowboard. But she's a very awkward person, and whether she's somewhere on the spectrum or not, I don't really know, but she's actually, even in her 30s, very anxious around people, especially people she doesn't know. And her explanation for why she is, as the lingo goes, so sex positive, is that she has a hard time connecting with people any other way. And this is a realm where, for all of her awkwardness and her fundamental shyness, where she's got great confidence. And she's got, confidence in her ability to enjoy herself, confidence in the fact that her partner will enjoy her or his self. It's a part of her life where she feels like she's a success, as opposed to many other parts.
But she never comes across as victim or victimized, even if she's highly self-critical and very aware of her many shortcomings, as she would say.
Yeah, I think that, like a lot of adolescents, she saw herself that way when, she was, as the story goes, Pinky broke her back at the age of 15 doing a stunt that she says she messed up because she suddenly was thinking about something insulting her mother had said to her. But anyway, she broke her back, and that was the end of her boarding career. So, and she, you know, she loved the painkillers and really became a drug user as a result of that. And she got arrested a lot. And, you know, as a 17-year-old, as an 18-year-old, you know, she did see herself as a victim. And she thought the cops were harassing her. And that was one reason she wanted to become a police officer, because she thought she could do a better job of it than the guys who were busting her chops. You know, but I think she's largely passed out of that phase, and she doesn't think she's got the greatest luck in the world. And, you know, to some extent, there's confirmation of it in the book. She doesn't fully accept the degree to which she has controlled her own bad luck, but, you know, and sort of made her own bad luck, as she does in a number of scenes in the novel. But I don't think she feels victimized, and she does accept responsibility for her own behavior.
And she has a rather unusual relationship with a character who's very familiar to all of your readers, her grandfather.
Yeah, yeah. You know, she and her grandfather, Sandy Stern, who was the defense lawyer in Presumed Innocent and has made recurring appearances, either cameos or major roles, in almost all of the novels that followed. Sandy is, you know, kind of buttoned up, proper Argentine gentleman, and Pinky is rash, nowhere near as articulate, impulsive, as you've said, and they just love each other to pieces. It's beyond either of their abilities to understand. And, you know, he's incredibly accepting of her, which is probably one secret to why she's so confident in his love for her.
But he also speaks directly to her.
Oh, she asks him for advice all the time, and he gives her the advice, and as he says, now I'm going to give you the advice that you came here to get, and I know you're going to ignore it. But, you know, you want to hear me say it, and I'm going to say it, and then you're going to go do what you want to do anyway.
Well, it's, you know, part of what's unique, both of you and I are of the age of grandchildren.
Yeah.
And not all relationships between grandchildren and their grandparents, or vice versa, are sort of boundaryless, which is the way I would describe it. It's just so open and free-flowing.
Yeah.
And it's not based on an agreement about what to do. It's based on something else. What is that?
Well, you know, about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, Adrian may remember when, I was between books and I decided I would write a young adult novel. And what I wanted to write about was my relationship with my own maternal grandfather, who candidly, everybody else in the family wavered between mild distaste to outright hatred. And I loved him totally, and we had this kind of open and, you know, free-flowing relationship. And the YA novel tried to capture it and wasn't very successful. It wasn't until I finished The Last Trial that I suddenly realized, oh, I just wrote that story. I reversed it in the sense that Pinky is the family member who nobody else can stand except her grandfather, but they have the same kind of bond in the relationship that you're describing.
Well, in Laws of Our Fathers.
Yeah. A book you're familiar with.
Extremely familiar with. I optioned the rights. Actually, I bought the rights with Universal to that, and have optioned others of Scott's movie books, and have been unsuccessful at putting a movie up on screen yet. or in one case, a TV series, which was actually quite a good pilot.
Yeah, and you've gotten pretty far, but
Okay.
just not
Close.
far enough.
Close. Enough because Scott needs to be humiliated now and then because things have gone very well for him, that I put him in the series as a lawyer, which was not much of a stretch, and his acting range is from A to A. But he did appear in the pilot, copies of which will be distributed at the end of this. No. So, in Laws of Our Fathers...
I never told you that I was a child actor, and that, you know...
You could have fooled me. But thank you for telling me now. But by the way, as you could probably imagine, Scott was a very, very good sport. And he performed with the writer of the series to be Hart Hansen, who had a pretty successful show on television called
Bones.
Bones, ran forever. At any rate...
And and beyond that, is a great guy and a terrific writer.
It was, for a lot of reasons, it was a great group of people, great actors that I think did justice to what Scott wrote, and should have happened. But should have, would have, could have, and a dime get you nothing.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
So, Laws of Our Fathers.
nobody in this room has heard about the
machinations
the
of our
slings and arrows of the film industry. So,
or as I used to say, the smallest club in the world is and should be the Directors' Sympathy League. So let's go to Laws of Our Fathers just for a second, and then I'm going to make another detour. So describe the principal relationship in that.
well, I mean, there are several crisscrossing relationships, but the actual heart of the novel is when the judge on a murder case finds that her college boyfriend, who is newly single, has shown up in her courtroom to observe this trial, because he's got a long-time relationship, as it happens, with the defendant. And that's certainly the central relationship as far as the author was concerned.
But the Laws of Our Fathers, what does that mean in the book?
Well, it definitely has to do, with the burdens that our parents impose on us. And one of the two central protagonists, Seth Weissman, is the child of Holocaust survivors, and finds the urgency that his parents have about his life, and he's, for better or for worse, an only child. And so it's just a tremendous burden to feel like it's up to him to vindicate their survival. And he has a very complicated relationship with his father.
Part of what the point of my questioning, that might be somewhat circuitous, was that it was not a series of relationships that were boundaryless. It was actually quite conflicted, correct?
Yeah, for sure.
And here, again, in this character who is so, for many people,
This, by the way, I think some of you who've shared the experience realize that this is a little like a Socratic interrogation where Avnet knows the answer.
Hold on one second. Interrogation, lawyer, highly acclaimed lawyer, very successful lawyer, no degree, never been in court, never interviewed anybody. So Socratic? Okay, maybe. All right, so continuing back to, we're going to get some more Socratic parts, by the way, if we have time, to the book. So let's talk about Rick, and he's her employer, and
Right.
it's a whole different kind of character to me.
Right.
And how would you describe him and his relationship to Pinky? And
Well, one of the things I have greatly enjoyed is sort of taking characters who float through the background of these novels and suddenly pushing them into the foreground. So Sandy Stern, The Burden of Proof was about his wife's suicide and Stern's search for the reasons that had taken place. And my friend Mike Robe is back there, and he knows that book pretty well, having filmed it. So, and Now, what was the question?
Rick.
Rick.
His
Okay,
relationship to Pinky.
so in the burden of proof, Sandy begins the romance that leads to his second and very happy marriage to Helen Dudek. And she happens to mention her son, who was struggling in those years. And that son is Rick. And Rick, as Pinky sees him, is somebody who's informed by the fact that he, flunked out of college and barely got into law school, and has really sort of had to struggle to make up for that. And who, as she puts it, knows that everybody has their stuff as a result of that. He is, of course, basically another family member. She goes from working for her grandfather and aunt. They closed their law office, and so she goes to, work for Rick, who was the son of Helen, Sandy's second wife, and with whom she also has always had a familial connection. And you can tell that he's taken her on, exotic and eccentric as she may be, out of a sense of family loyalty.
So when the book starts, Rick gets a case, and the case is with the chief of police, a woman.
Right.
And would you care to describe that, or would you want me to butcher it?
No, I'll butcher my own work, thank you. The first chapter, Pinky wants to talk about her very strange next door neighbor, and Rick is like, just, wait a minute. We got this client coming in. We're really not completely retained. She's not given us, the retainer, and so he tries to draw it back to the case. And the case is that, in the way it's written, you don't know in the first chapter that there's a gender reversal about to take place. So they talk about the chief of police in the town that they're sitting in, Highland Isle, across the river from Kendall County. And
is Kendall County owned by you?
I like to think so, but certainly when you go back and study the various film contracts that have tied us together, you'll see that I maintain proprietorship.
I am well aware of it.
But at any rate, they talk about the police chief, and the chief, no gender at first, is accused of exploiting the chief's power and extracting sexual favors from 3 officers on the police force in exchange for promotions.
Is that what was called sextortion?
Yes, sextortion is I think a term of my own coinage, but anyway.
I've not seen it elsewhere.
But it's certainly sextortion, and then you find out at the end of the first chapter that the chief is female and the accusers are male. And so we have a sort of
reversal.
Yeah, you have a reversal of expectations and a realm of accusations with which we're all very familiar.
And there are multiple male accusers.
Three male accusers, and as it turns out, it's a little complicated. Rick says after their interview with Lucia Barrera Gomez, that he says, this is easy. We're going to run out the string on all the procedural stuff, and then you'll get on the stand and say, I never had sex with any of these guys. And she's like, wait a minute, we need to talk about that. So
it's, I would say, a hot button topic.
Yeah, I would think.
And reversed the roles there. And
right. And I think, the law has its firm categories. And so what is sexual assault when committed by a male is sexual assault when committed by a female. But there is just no denying that, everything that's packed into gender roles, including just the sheer physical difference between men and women, gives a really different gloss to something that we're all, you know, that we've all heard a lot about recently. But, you know, Pinky's reaction from the start was she's very eager to, you know, be involved in the defense of the chief because she thinks this is all nonsense. And she says to Rick, how could she have forced them? They're all a head taller than she is, and they're carrying a .38. I mean, so you explain to me how she forced them.
So let's do something you do extremely well in your books. Let's change the direction of the narrative to the neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
So I found this character just fascinating, as did my wife, who's the better reader in the family and the more important reader. Where did this character come from?
The correct answer is I don't know. I had, and I can't fully answer the question without, you know, a great big spoiler, so which I'm not going to do. But I mean, you start out, you're thinking about things, you're writing a little bit, and I had an idea of how the neighbor would fit into the story, and I loved it. So the neighbor had secured his place. But as for the particulars of the neighbor, who's of, you know, mixed Chinese and Hmong ancestry,
Spelled
H-M-O-N-G. They're the Vietnamese mountain people who came to the U.S. when the...
and fought on the side of the U.S.
They fought. They were great, you know, illiterate, but most of them incredibly attuned to electronics. And so they'd be in the mountains and they'd call in the U.S. airstrikes or warn them of enemy positions. And they had to be evacuated, of course, when the DM regime fell.
So let's follow this without dealing with spoilers for a second. There's an enormous amount of technological information.
Yeah.
Where in God's name did you get that? It's about snooping.
Yeah, the surveillance techniques that are contemporary. Mostly just reading. You know, I've occasionally, I was a federal prosecutor for years, so I have at times gone to my friends who were FBI agents or even are, but there are two problems with that. One, of course, being my friends. They're older, most of them have retired and don't know about what's, you know, cutting edge. And the other is it's uncomfortable for them when they do know about what's cutting edge, because they don't want to, you know, give away secrets that are meant to be kept. So rather than calling up my, you know, good buddy Kevin Deary and saying, you know, and he's helped me in the past, but I just figured I can read about this, you know. And when you get on the internet and start saying surveillance equipment, it's astonishing what comes up. And it's not even dark web. It's just out there describing all of this amazing new machinery. And you know, the one that just shocked me when I first read about it is something called the laser tab, which basically treats a window as the vibrating element in a microphone. And the laser will pick up the vibrations in the glass, and through, you know, computer programming, it's able to intercept the sound from that's happening on the other side of the glass. And I mean, I had no idea there were such things as laser taps till I started doing this research. But there are, and they are employed by law enforcement pretty readily.
So you don't do it the easy way, which is what I do, which is we hire experts on film who tell us everything, so we don't have to hunt through the web ourselves, and also we have people tell us when we're wrong all the time.
Yeah, that's convenient. So
It's
I make
very
my
helpful.
own mistakes. So
Well, I would do a race with you on who makes more mistakes, and I think I might win. But
Well, I mean, I know that there will be some reader who will tell me, well, it doesn't work exactly that way. And I'm sure that'll be true. I've done my best to be correct, but.
so, do you feel we could talk a little bit about Pinky's, anything having to do with her relationship, the key relationship in the book, or is that too much?
Well, Pinky is fascinated with this guy. Rick suggests to her immediately in the first chapter, he says, what does he look like? As she's trying to talk about her weird neighbor. And she says, I don't know, he's Asian. He says, no, you tell me he disappears for 2 hours a day to go work out. I mean, he must look pretty good. She says, oh, no, I'm not interested in older guys. I'm interested in older women. But she begins spying on him to try to figure. She's convinced from the beginning that he's like a hit man or he's in witness protection because he's very strange. He will not interact with any of the neighbors. He won't even take the old mail out of his mailbox. He doesn't look at anything. And, she's spying on the guy and she hears absolutely nothing from next door. And so she's very intuitive, which sometimes she's right, sometimes she's wrong. And, she decides that maybe he's a hitman, he's here to kill somebody. Maybe he's in witness protection. But she just goes further, further I think is the right word rather than farther, but she goes further and further in her spying on him.
Against the advice of?
Oh, Rick tells her, he sounds like a guy who wants to be left alone, so leave him alone. She can't.
What does her grandfather say?
Right. Well, by then it's too late, but so she knows that Pinky can't help herself. It's not like she doesn't respect the rules. She understands why there are rules. She understands why they need to be enforced, but she has what she credits as a cop attitude, which is true and untrue, based on my extensive experience with police officers, and there I really do know what I'm talking about. I know the rules, I enforce the rules, ergo I don't have to follow the rules. And there's a lot of that in Pinky.
So, speaking of something you know a lot about, let's talk about her friend, the cop, who is an ex-paramour.
She's Tanya Io, who's of Philippine ancestry, and they met in the police academy, where Pinky unfortunately flunked out in the last week, having blown a drug test. Tanya went on and has had a really good career. She's moved up in the Highland Isle Police Department, is now a detective, and Pinky knows that their prior relationship did not end well. And it did not end well because as Pinky is now able to say through the lens of time, it ended poorly because she behaved like an asshole. So she's reluctant to approach Tanya, but the chief cannot ask around about her accusers. Because, of course, that would smack of obstruction. So she has to find somebody else on the police force who can talk to her about the accusers. And Tanya, of course, is bitter about the end of the prior relationship. And and is not really interested in helping Pinky so much as sort of revisiting the past. And that's how they start out.
So it's to me a freighted, relationship clearly, and at the same time, they both have something they want, even if it's disparate. So Pinky needs her for information, and Tanya hopefully believes she can rekindle the flame,
Right.
correct?
And if not, then at least understand what went wrong.
Pinky's not good at explaining what goes wrong.
No. Pinky actually knows in this case. But, she says ultimately that, the real problem was that Tanya was a nester. And that, and that Pinky is not. And she has a clear vision of where Tanya's going to be in 10 years. She's going to find somebody, and she says their house is going to be filled with little tchotchkes that are precious to them because of the amount of time they've spent together, looking for this object and deciding it's beautiful and that they want to have it. And that's just never going to be Pinky.
So what I hope to do is to sketch kind of the framework of the world that the book is in. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask about the Ritz.
Ah, yes. Well, I've always tried to write bad guys for whom a case can be made. In other words, that, they misbehave, but they have reasons that if you look at the world from their perspective, those reasons might even appear to be valid. I think Ritz is the most unalloyed evil guy that I've ever used as a villain in one of my novels. And he is, as Lucia has known him for years and years, says he's just bad to the bone. And he's very strange, absolutely brilliant. In terms of book smarts, the smartest police officer anybody has, ever worked with. But his father was a corrupt cop in Kendall County, and he just can't see the world as anything other than an opportunity for corruption. He would probably be like, a Chicago alderman I know who once explained to me that his view that everybody is corrupt. And some people are more hypocritical about it than others.
Did I have dinner with that alderman with you?
You might have, but anyway, we digress.
So, in terms of the web, something's rotten in Highland Isle.
Yeah.
And here's a cop who was #1 in his class, brilliant as you say, and he, in some form or another, is behind it. I think we should leave out the cops who are testifying for now. And what in effect put this in motion is something that transpired well before the book started, correct?
Right, absolutely. But Ritz is, he is brilliant, and he has become a big real estate developer in Highland Isle, supposedly by investing a lot of the money that the guys who would have been in the mafia generation before, that money they have on the sidelines because they don't want the feds to find it. And and this I purely made up, but I loved it. I represented a lot of franchise fast food sellers, and it turns out that those companies make their money by charging rent to the franchisees and taking a rake off about 17% as rent of the proceeds. And so they are, the good ones, very, very careful about protecting their brand and making sure that their franchisees are good operators. But Ritz has got the same thing going with various drug dealers in Highland Isle. And he rents them the space for their stash houses and their, drug operations, and takes 17% off the top. And
But he's laundering too.
oh, he's got all kinds of stuff going on. He's a brilliant guy, and he's got all kinds of schemes.
So
But he can't resist criminality.
well, in your world, as I've read it, experienced it, the world is pretty corrupt.
Well, yeah, there's quite a bit of corruption. Yeah.
And, and
Certainly a Chicagoan would have to agree with that observation.
as a filmmaker who shot there many times, we used to refer to Chicago as a town where you could get things done.
Yeah, that hasn't changed.
It actually is changing a little bit, but it's going to change back. And just like digression. I was in Chicago shooting this show, Justified, City Primeval, which is an extension of the original Justified. So I saw Scott there, and I saw Adrian, and there was two people in opposing cars were firing AK-47s at them, and they drove right through the barricades of the set where we were shooting. And I think there were about 60 rounds were expended there, and it was like, what? And and filming is a big economic boon to wherever it happens. I mean, a lot of people get hired, hotel rooms, food, and so on and so forth. So now Chicago is going to make a real effort to bring people back because the crew got scared for understandable reasons. We shut down for 2.5 days, and it's just, scary.
It's scary.
Yeah, and stuff in Chicago, and I'm not picking on Chicago as the only place in the world that's happening. It's a little crazy and a little frightening, and sounds like the way you've depicted it over a longer period of time. Not quite the same level of.
Well, the gun violence is not really new, but what's new is that this is like Willie Sutton, who was asked why he robs banks,
Yeah.
and he said, because that's where the money is. Yeah. And a lot of these kids, and of course it's young people, have suddenly realized, and for whatever reason George Floyd's murder was the crystallizing event, why commit crime in our own neighborhood where nobody has much? Why don't we go, to the Magnificent Mile and, the wealthy parts of town and commit crimes there? We can hijack really nice cars, and that's what's happening, and the huge gun violence, for which the mayor and the police and the state's attorney gets blamed, with nary a mention of the gun manufacturers.
So let's go back for a second to, well, I'll call Scott's world, if you will.
Okay.
And in Scott's world, there are people who get things done, and in order to do it, there are levels of corruption. Like gerrymandering, I would call legalized corruption,
Yeah.
correct?
There's a lot of legalized corruption.
Right, and campaign contributions, whatever you want to call it. The way the parties do it, it's sort of,
That's probably the worst of what we've got going,
But whatever it is, in Chicago, as you depicted it, was, again, there was a way to get things done, and there were people who were good and more honest, very honest, wherever you put them on the scale. And then there were people who were always trying to make a buck on the side. And, that's part of this world in terms of the police again.
Yeah.
And what's different is just that the Ritz is, he's so smart, so sophisticated, so contemporary in many ways.
Right, no question.
So is that the worldview?
Well, I don't accept the view of my friend that everybody is corrupt and, that everybody will steal when given the opportunity. I literally don't think that is true. But there are a lot of people who do. And they do that for a variety of reasons. Some, because they come from great need, and they really don't understand any rationale for not taking what they need if they've got an opportunity to get it. And others, like Ritz, who do it for, intense personal gratification, just to prove, in Ritz's case, that he's smarter than everybody else. And he's so smart that he doesn't have to follow the rules. They'll never get him because he knows how law enforcement works. And
it's his intimate knowledge of it that
Yeah.
he feels he's exploiting, correct?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, he's a former cop and still with deep connections in the local police department. And, he just gets tremendous satisfaction out of being uncatchable.
So let me ask a question that I often ask myself, and I always get the answer wrong.
This reminds me of the people who say that, oh, those trial scenes are great, the cross-examination's terrific. And I finally say, cross-examination's a lot easier when you both get to write the question and the answer. So, okay, let's hear about your interrogation of yourself.
Well, I could do that, but I'll start with you first. What's it about? How would you describe what it's about as the author?
Suspect?
Yeah.
I had a pretty clear vision. You asked why did I want to write about Pinky, and what came to me very quickly was looking at the character that existed in the prior book and this person I had a feeling for. Pinky says in that, those lines that you read just to start the book, that she's weird. She does have this goth jewelry that makes it look like she's got a common nail through her nose. And
a lot of ink.
Yeah, inked from ankle to the neck, as she puts it. And she doesn't get social cues. She insults people unknowingly, unwittingly all the time. And stuff comes out of her mouth that seems perfectly logical to her, that's just a complete non sequitur to everybody else. And she's right. She's really different. She doesn't want the same stuff that everybody else wants. She's not really sure she'll ever want a partner. She's uncomfortable around other people. She says that the pandemic was a great relief to her because she didn't have to interact with anybody. And, at heart, to me, this is about a young woman who is coming to terms with her own strangeness. And there's, to me, a great poignance in that, because she's accepting a lot of loneliness as being her lot in life. But there's still a great triumph for her in that, she's become a private investigator by accident, and it turns out that she's really good at it. And it's a novel that is about yet another young person finding her way in the world and finding out who she is.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense to me as a reader. What I was going to say about getting it wrong is when I write something, like on Fried Green Tomatoes, I thought, okay, it's a story about the power of storytelling, and how it affects people. And I worked on it for a long time, so on and so forth. The movie came out, a lot of people responded well to it, there's a lot written about it.
It's a pretty damn good movie.
Thank you. And, but that's what I thought until about 6 months after a young woman, I think she was 10 years old, whose mother was a professor at Cal State Fullerton. This young woman really liked the movie and 10 years of age. And the mother said, well, why? And she said, well, it's a good movie. And the mother said, as a professor, well, what's it about? And the young girl said, it's about how we tell stories to keep people we love alive. And I went, that's what it's about. And if you would have asked me 1,000 times, I never would have said that out of the mouths of babes. And the reason why I indulged myself in you in this story is because so much of the richness of writing is the unconscious connections that you make.
For sure.
And, and those are, de facto things that we're not aware of. And it may be a voice that you hear, like in Pinky's case, but there are all these connections. And, when you say it's about this young woman who is weird, coming to terms with her, in effect, strangeness, weirdness, and accepting both the loneliness and whatever the positive things are, and starting to make a movement into being able to have a productive job for her and use her skills.
And feel better about herself.
And feel better and be good at it.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me. And I'm always curious, where these things, come to, because when you say, okay, you wrote her in the prior book, with Trial, and, people responded, and they did, I think, and yet you anchored a whole story around her.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty gutsy move. I mean, a priori, I would go, huh? Scott.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And as supportive as I might be at any given moment, I'd still say, Scott.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Norman Mailer said the horrible thing about being a novelist is it's the one profession where you don't know you've made a horrible mistake for 6 months. And, and he's right, wouldn't be the first time I'd written something and then realized 6 months or even a year on, I've just wasted all that time because I really can't crack this character. But I will say one thing, and going a little sideways from your question. I think that, the created world has to be coherent. I think we're being signaled, although I don't know in what way. It has to be coherent, it has to be credible, it has to seem to have meaning. But I've never been sure that it's the author's obligation to be able to say what that meaning is. And I say that because fiction is about conflict, narrative of all kinds, whether it's on film or on the page. It's about conflict and ambiguity and contradiction. And if there was a shorter way to say it that carried all of the fullness of the narrative work, then there wouldn't be any need for the narrative work. But in point of fact, it's to experience that entire world of conflict and contradiction and ambiguity. That's why the novel or the movie or the streaming series exists.
Well, I agree. I don't think it matters whether you can articulate it and be right or not. I think what's important is that you write it.
Yeah.
And then you, that Norman Mailer line is going to haunt me for many years. I think we're being told that it's time to get questions from the audience.
Sort of probably a excessively simple question, but I was wondering where Kendall County came from. Was it at all a poke in the eye of electric readers, or how did you come up with that?
No, of course, Kendall County long preceded the reading device that Amazon sells. And so there's always been some suspicion, since the guy who's the head of that division is a Chicagoan, that, maybe there was a nod, or maybe it was just that it was a good word and he liked it. But Kendall County came about in a really simple way. The presumed innocent was drawn from experiences I had while I was a clerk or an intern in the Suffolk County, that is to say the Boston DA's office, while I was in my last year of law school. And originally that's what I thought I was writing about, was Boston. And I don't keep a diary or a journal. I pump all of those sort of tasty little morsels that I observe into the fiction. And so that meant, since I was working as an AUSA while I was writing Presumed Innocent, that the city began to look less and less like Boston and more like Chicago. So it's this sort of amalgam. It's a city basically about the size of Boston. You know, in the metropolitan area of Kendall County is about the size of the metropolitan area of Boston. But it looks a lot like Chicago. So it's neither fish nor fowl. And I gave it that name, and then I just felt like I was at home there.
You mentioned your last year of law school, and I'm curious what, if anything, has changed about law school since you wrote 1L?
Well, I could be a smartass and say I'm fortunate not to know the answer because I'm not in law school anymore. But I have followed the developments. And, you know, I look back at the end of 1L and I think, frankly, that I predicted a lot of the changes that, in point of fact, have come about. And I will say that one of the most important changes has been driven by the U.S. News rankings. And institutions are no longer free to ignore the consumers, which is to say their students. And so the students are now treated with more respect than they were in my era, which was far better than the era of 30 or 40 years before, where literally at many law schools they would, you know, use that old stunt, which is look to your left, look to your right, you know, one of you is not going to be here at the end of the first semester. So the teaching methods had no need to be as harsh as they were, and they're not any longer. And certainly at Harvard Law School, Elena Kagan made a huge difference in telling the faculty that they were not the only part of the institutional structure that was important, that the students were very important too. And it was news to a lot of the faculty.
Yes. I think your mic's coming. Oh, wait.
I wonder if you could evaluate the legal events that we're living through now as a work of fiction. How is it playing out if you were to write it?
Well, are we referring to our ex-president? I was commissioned by the Washington Post. Sounds like my mic has gone dead, but I'll speak up. I was commissioned by the Washington Post when one of the initial, the Mueller investigation was going on. And I was supposed to write it as a choose-your-own-adventure with multiple endings. And, you know, essentially it cratered because none of them seemed credible, and yet it was all happening. You know, I think for many of us, we never really thought we would see such brazen disregard for the norms that many of us regard as essential and important. You know, but it's happening right before our eyes, and it's happening with substantial public support. I will never believe it will have a majority of Americans behind it, but I've been wrong all along in judging this particular phenomenon. But, you know, the rule of law is really the heart of democracy. You can't have a democracy without having the rule of law. And You got rules and you have to follow them. And I've never been one of these Americans who just cheerfully believes that our democracy will survive no matter what. Because we've been, I remember one of my partners came to me and he said, you know, look at what's happening. And this was right while the Bush and Gore election was being contested. He says, this is an amazing country, he said. You've got, you know, 2 contestants who fought this long campaign, and, you know, the prior president was impeached, and there was one other just sort of momentous event. He said, and we have never once seen troops in the street. And I both acknowledged that it was a remarkable testament to the American democracy that people had faith that there was going to be some kind of institutional answer, even though I ultimately didn't agree with it. But I don't think we're at that point anymore. You have, you know, a politician who's threatening, you know, huge civil unrest if he's forced to answer to the law. And it's a huge test of American democracy. I think we're going to survive it. I hope we're going to survive it, but I'm not saying it's an absolute certainty.
Any more cheery questions? Well, I would just say to any of you here who have not read the editorial that you wrote for the New York Times on the death penalty.
Well, that was started out as an article in the New Yorker, but yeah.
Scott, well, why don't you talk about the commission and how that came about?
Well, I started out as a prosecutor, and I was never sure about the death penalty, but I was sure about the right of the community to make its judgments about what was the fitting punishment for certain crimes. And I reached the point by the time I left the U.S. Attorney's Office after 8 years there, that I thought if somebody handed me the right case, and I was told to seek the death penalty, even though I wasn't sure I myself would ever impose the death penalty were I a judge, that I could do that. And then I went into private practice and had the experience of representing a man who had been sentenced to death, who I knew very quickly was innocent. He was incapable of doing what he was accused of doing. And of course, that began to change my perspective on capital punishment. And ultimately, my conclusion was that capital punishment is kind of the land's end of the law, and that we will never be able to construct a legal system for capital punishment that gives Americans what they want, which is, you know, ultimate punishment for ultimate evil. And it sounds simple in practice, but it never works out. You know, there are inherent inequalities that get magnified in the system, so that, you know, at one point it was true that, you know, simply because you were particularly black, but also brown, that you were more likely to be sentenced to death, and that's no longer true if you're making a comparison between white and minority defendants. But what is true still, and hasn't changed, even though it's been noticed for about 20 years now, is that what does control is the race of the victim. And you're 2 to 3 times more likely to be sentenced to death for killing a white person in this country than for killing an African American or generally a person of Latin origin. And the inequalities in power and status and wealth are such that you just can't turn around and correct that. So that's just one example of something that will never be set right. And you can stress all you want and try to redesign the system and do what Mitt Romney wanted to do when he was governor of Massachusetts and say that, only that the death penalty will only be imposed where there's, certain scientific evidence, which means that Timothy McVeigh wouldn't have gotten the death penalty because there was no scientific evidence in that case, just 160 dead bodies. It just won't work. It will never give people what they want. And it's incredibly prone to error because of the nature of the crimes, and which by their character just disturb the judgment of everybody in the criminal justice system. So that was the argument that was made in that article, which I then expanded into a little book called Ultimate Punishment.
Well, it was, to me, when I read it, the clarity of your argument and the persuasiveness of the logic and clarity of thought was striking, and I thought was very useful for people to look at if they were on the fence.
Yeah, I think it's time for us to wind up, but I'll say just, since I had held so many different opinions about the death penalty, I refuse to criticize anybody for believing what they believe about it, because at one point in time I believed the same thing they do now. So